So she just had a couple of trans people helping her come up with these items. Yeah, she did. I don't even think she knows what it means to validate a scale psychometrically. But she created this scale, and critically, the scale assumes you have breasts, right? It only has meaning if you have breasts. So it was rigged in a similar way as the Dutch study item switching. What she did is she asked these girls questions like if they bind at night. That's one of the items on the chest dysphoria scale. If they bind at night, well, bind what? And this is in reference to chest binders, which a lot of these girls are encouraged to use. It's unhealthy, it's risky. That really tightly binds their breasts, their chest, and they might wear them, at night when they sleep and what have you, and maybe during the day too. And this is this, sort of rejection of their bodies, rejections of their femininity, and so on. Some of which, can be driven by sexual assault, right? And other factors that you want to learn about to find out what's going on. No, but these people never do. But so they asked them if they bind at night. Well, you just cut off their breasts. What are they going to bind? There's nothing to bind, right? So that's invalid. So of course they say no. In fact, every single participant said no to that, obviously, since there's nothing left to bind.
Remember when the so-called science of pediatric sex changes was supposedly settled? And then it turned out that the actual science was hardly settled at all? Pepperidge Farms remembers, and so does Dr. José Duarte. He is a data analyst who studies the methodological validity of social science. We all need to become better consumers of science, and that really starts with understanding how and why scientists use statistics to lie to us. José Duarte, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. I'm happy to talk.
For listeners who don't know you at all, could you please just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a social psychologist um, who has focused primarily on ideological political bias in academic research, especially academic psychology research, but now in other areas, and also political and ideological bias in media coverage and so-called fact checkers. So gender ideology and what's been happening to kids caught my interest just a few years ago, and I was reluctant. I was a slow comer to it because it I knew how bad academia was researching more mundane topics. Right? I knew how bad the standards were, how low the standards were, how invalid much of the research was, how false many of the claims are, and just how abysmally low the standards are in academia. And I was really afraid to look at what they would have done with uh, the medicalization of trans indoctrinated kids and the research that existed out in that domain. I was afraid they would be just as sloppy and use invalid statistics and just have no higher standards than they had for everything else. So I was afraid to look. So I've been kind of slow to come to this and then accelerated in the last couple of years and finally took a hard look at what's going on.
I read that you are into objectivism. That's Ayn Rand. I hope this question does not seem off topic, but I find it fascinating because Rand was resolutely opposed to the philosophy of altruism. Everyone thinks her philosophical nemesis is Karl Marx, and to be sure, she loathes communism, but really, that book, Atlas Shrugged, in my opinion, is a rejection of Auguste de Comte and his idea of altruism, which has evolved into the Tides Foundation. Like if you went back in time and you told Ayn Rand nothing about George Soros, other than what he's been doing in the last 20 years, she would already hate him because she was against altruism. And so much of this weaponized empathy these days, a lot of the sort of fake science news is coming from a nonprofit world. It's being driven from that sector through the media with the compliance and help of the media. And I've actually been thinking about that connection for just a minute now. So, what would Ayn Rand make of transgender ideology, if do you think? If you went back in time and told her, for example, what's happening with pediatric transition, what would be her response?
Oh, it's amazing to think about Ayn Rand in the modern world. So she died in the early 80s, over 40 years ago. And she died an old woman, so she was, fully a product of the 20th century. She would have vaporized gender ideology, uh, and she would have done it as soon as she came into contact with it. The only question is, how long would it take her to come into contact with it? That's an interesting point because this ideology sort of snuck up on most of us. It 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 wasn't even something I was aware of when I defended my dissertation in 2015. No one in our department had or purported to have pronouns, for example. I had no idea what that would have been about. And so this happened very quickly, and it's a very strange situation because the ideology is a very compact set of proclamations and declarations, uh, and it conceals pretty much everything that's happening underneath. It conceals what's happening to kids. It conceals what's happening to girls and women's sports, all behind these Orwellian euphemisms, like trans kid and inclusion and acceptance and so on. So she would have she would have left no one on the field if she had, engaged with this ideology. Though I think the harder question is whether she would have gotten along with the other people fighting this ideology, right? It's really interesting to imagine Ayn Rand and J.K. Rowling uh, in, you know, discussing things with each other, in the same room, maybe at a forum or something like of that nature. Um, I think one of the challenges with this, I don't know what we call it, the gender critical, gender realist, um, anti-gender ideology movement is that people are a lot of the people in the movement are sort of unfriendly and abrasive, and they don't necessarily get along with each other. And it goes beyond the conflict between like hardcore conservatives, male conservatives, like Matt Walsh, and the TERFs who generally come from the left, and all these nth wave feminists. I lost track of all the waves, but it it goes beyond that. It's not a very friendly movement. People seem to be uh, sort of, I don't know, protecting their turf or something. So, and Ayn Rand was not known for getting along with people very well. So I know she would have laid waste to the ideology. I don't know how good she would have been at building an alliance.
So, from that philosophical foundation, you've looked at the Cass Review, you've written about the Dutch Protocol, the study that Joanna Olson Kennedy did, also other studies. Let's just start at the top line and work our way down. Wesley Yang did a long introduction to a piece you did for him a couple of years ago, and he compared it to the financial instruments that caused the 2008 market crash. So, you tell me in your words, what happened here? How did the junk science get settled, scare quotes? How did that happen?
Right. So a key issue with this topic is that there's actually very little science, by which I mean primary studies, published studies, the currency of science, peer-reviewed journal articles, right? There are very, very few. So it's much different from other politicized domains, uh, generally politicized by the left, like climate science consensus research, research on gun ownership, gun control, stereotype threat, implicit bias, and so on. In those areas, there typically is a large body of research, much of it invalid, much of it rigged, most of it false. But in this area, gender ideology and these ministrations they're performing on children, there's hardly any research. So it didn't become a domain of scientific discovery. It is not a domain of scientific discovery where there was a flurry of research and someone discovered trans kids. Oh my God, we discovered, some kids are trans, some humans are trans, and here's what that means. No, that's not what happened. What happened was before any research was published in 2007, the first people in America to start a sterilizing treatment on children, to start sterilizing children, which is the full regimen of puberty blockers followed by cross-sex hormones. It's the hormones that are principally the sterilizing agent, but I think puberty blockers can have an effect or they can interact with the hormones to that end. The first people to do that was Boston Children's Hospital in America in 2007. Before that, it was just the Dutch and maybe the British around the same time. So they started doing this to kids at Boston Children's in '07 before any research on on this protocol was published in reference to, the effects on the well-being of children, like their psychological health and depression, anxiety, the typical self-report psychology variables, right? So they started in '07 and they just started doing it. No research. The principal Dutch findings, I think, would not come out for a few years. So the and then by some point between 2007 and 2012, someone started taking a knife to kids. Someone started taking a scalpel and performing mutilating surgeries on children. Most likely, the first was the full double mastectomy, the complete double mastectomy on girls, trans indoctrinated girls who think they're boys or what have you. Or more recently, they might you might see as many who claim that they're so-called non-binary as those who claim that they're boys. So that started by 2012. I'm saying between '07 and 2012 because the first recorded, documented instance of it uh, was in was going back to 2012 in a recently published paper by Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. So that started by '12. By 2016, Children's Hospital LA was in full swing because the journal article that you've seen me write about from Joanna Olson Kennedy is a 2017 or 2018 journal article referring to things they did to girls in 2016. So in half of 2016, they took a bunch of girls and they cut off their healthy breasts. So the numbers were 33 that we know about. If you add half the abandoned set, that's another 13, so probably somewhere around 46. And that was just in 6 months of 2016. By 2016, they were a going concern. I mean, they were at Children's Hospital LA, they were in full swing. 46 girls, 13 and up in just half the year, right? So this all started right without any evidentiary base. First of all, no one discovered trans kids. No one discovered that there is a type of human who is innately this thing, and this thing is trans. And there's no basis in science or medicine or reality for it. There's nothing that doctors can do to say this child is trans in any sense other than lexical, other than they say they're trans or they say, they identify as whatever. So they just started doing this. And then around the same time, they cobbled together a few studies. And now we might have 4 or 5 studies that are relevant to this topic. And before someone comes back with a claim of a much larger number of studies, Here's what I'm referring to. I'm referring to studies that are about kids. That's number one. Like the giving them puberty blockers, sterilizing hormones, or some sort of mutilating surgery, most commonly the double mastectomy, sometimes genital surgery. A study that's about doing that to kids and follows up with some attempt to measure well-being. Typically it's a self-report psychological scale. That's all we have at this point. So of those studies where it's an original study, right? We only have four or five that I know about at this point. The Dutch study would count as at least two papers, whereas the other ones only have the one paper. And they're all invalid. Much of the data is suppressed. Johanna Wilson Kennedy has withheld many of her outcome variables. And as you probably saw in the New York Times, she was refusing to release the results of her puberty blocker study last year, NIH funded and so on. So um, that's all we have, just a handful of studies, most of them invalid. And so this wasn't the typical story of consensus or, the science is settled, which that should always that should always make you nervous if you hear something about the science being settled. If it's not about the Earth orbiting the sun or similar, yeah, that should always make you wonder. But instead, what happened here is not this grassroots scientific discovery and some even a manipulated consensus. It's only a handful of people even doing or trying to do this kind of research. What happened is that leftists just skip to the ending, right? They skip to just asserting through these organs like these leftist medical lobbies, the American Medical Association, the American Association of Pediatrics, the AAP, the APA Psychiatry, in addition to the APA Psychology, they're both the APA, and the Endocrine Society, and so on. These leftist medical lobbies just started asserting that this care is medically necessary and that it's life-saving, right? And this is based on the suicide myth. And that they say it's evidence-based, and they might throw in a few mentions of science. But unlike the other topics, they have nothing, right? They have nothing to back those statements. And what we learned in discovery from like the Alabama lawsuit and other cases, like getting materials from WPATH, the main leftist lobby focused on this issue, is that they were motivated. Some of these groups were motivated to assert that they were medically necessary treatments, that they were and perhaps even life-saving, in order to get insurance coverage and in order to help them with lawsuits and legal cases. So these are not scientific groups. So this refrain we always hear from leftist media about every major medical association. Yeah, I guess we could say every major medical association, but who cares? It, that just means they're not going to be major medical associations for very long because these are just leftist medical lobbies. And we can just go look at their websites and see how partisan and political the AMA and the AAP and all the rest are, right? These are people who are not driven by scientific evidence. I mean, the AAP was advocating masking toddlers. They've made false claims that firearms are the leading cause of death for children in America, wildly false. And so their interest is mostly politics. And if you look at the AAP's recommendation or policy statement that is often cited by the media, it I was surprised. I was expecting it to cite, some of the invalid research we've talked about, like the Olson Kennedy study of cutting off the girl's healthy breasts, right? Maybe they would cite that as evidence, insanely, of some sort of improvement in, what Olson Kennedy called chest dysphoria. But no, their their statement, their policy statement on supporting so-called gender affirming care does not actually cite evidence of benefit. It's mostly just boilerplate text, and it describes, standards that they just came up with, and it has some definitions, and it doesn't review any scientific evidence. It doesn't try to make any sort of scientific case. And when they cited Olson Kennedy, it was just incidental. It was, they didn't even cite her to refer to the main thrust of that study. They cited her because of something she said in the paper that they wanted backing for. And it was just some background thing about a trend in kids getting surgeries or something. It was just some mundane background thing. So none of these organizations have done a systematic review, right? They wouldn't know how to, so let's not encourage them. But the AMA, AAP, they have not actually done anything empirically to determine or establish that cutting off a healthy girl's breasts is good for her, or that giving kids puberty blockers because of something they say, because they repeat back these leftist trans abstractions in which they were indoctrinated, that somehow helps them to give them puberty blockers and sterilizing hormones, that it saves their lives, it prevents suicide, right? And one wonders why we didn't have all these suicides back in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and for all of human history before now, because of trans kids not being able to get puberty blockers and hormones and so on. So it they don't actually cite evidence. This isn't a case where I'm not sure they've ever even said the science is settled. They do say evidence-based, science-based, life-saving, but they're just asserting that. And that's what's new. They're just asserting it. And partly they're doing it because of our twisted healthcare system and how insurance driven it is. This is the ideology. This is just core tenets of trans ideology, gender ideology. The ideology stipulates that a child knows who they are in the sense of having a so-called gender identity. Well, who told them to have a gender identity? Humans don't need to have gender identities, right? But they stipulate that a child knows who they are, which was one of the craziest, wildly false things you could say on this planet is that a child knows who they are. I mean, a 22-year-old doesn't even know who they are, right? But they just stipulate that, and they stipulate that this care, so-called care, is medically necessary. So they're skipping all the steps. There's not really a scientific foundation here. There's hardly any research. It's one of those cases, like to get to another point you wanted to talk about later, as far as how people can navigate science. This is one of those cases where there's actually very little science to navigate. There are very few papers, very few studies. So that makes it easier. That makes it easier for someone to navigate.
There are all sorts of problems with the Dutch protocol. Most famous of all is where they flipped the female and male questionnaires. So you had the trans-identified girls being asked about how do you feel about your erections, you know. Um, and of course, this madness was all done in order to justify what they were doing. What are those problems? What are the flaws in the scientific method that were at the core of this, at the beginning, as practiced by actual scientists that created this bad research?
Well, the Dutch protocol, that's where it all began, and they took a group of kids, boys and girls, who were trans indoctrinated. And of course, the first thing you should do if you're a doctor and a child comes to you, you should imagine you're a neutral philosopher, but a good one. Yeah. And or yeah, if you're coming in clean and a child comes to you and says, they're trans, well, you would immediately want to know what that means. And if they said it means that my gender identity doesn't match the sex I was assigned at birth, if that's what a child says or that's what, their parents say or whatever, then you would stop right there and you wouldn't proceed, right? Because you blow the whistle right there for a couple of reasons, but let's set that aside for a moment. But they took these kids and they had a gender dysphoria scale they gave these kids, right? And there's one for boys and one for girls. And the reason is because boys and girls have comprehensively different bodies, and you can't really ask about something like gender dysphoria without tailoring it to, who you're talking to, right? So um, they would ask questions like, you they give them items and you have to like agree or disagree, right? I think it was a 5 point scale. So one of the items, like you mentioned, was I dislike having erections. And an item for the girls would be I hate having breasts and I dislike having periods uh, and so on. So in the beginning of the study with these boys and girls in the Dutch study, they gave them the correct measures, right? So the boy was answering the item, I dislike having erections, and I hate myself because I'm a boy, and so on. And the girl would be asked, I hate menstruating because it makes me feel like a girl. I hate having breasts, right? So they were completing these questionnaires, and then after that initial measurement, they started giving them puberty blockers, hormones. In some cases, they performed mutilating surgeries in the Dutch study, but they don't report the numbers for those in their paper. So midway through, after I don't know how many months, maybe a year, uh, they switched the measures, as you said. So now the boy is rating the item, I hate menstruating because it makes me feel like a girl. I hate having breasts. Uh, and the girl is given the item, I dislike having erections. Right? So you can imagine what that does. Well, the girl's not going to have any erections. The question has no meaning. Very similar, I'll mention in a minute, to what Olson Kennedy did after she cut off those girls' breasts. So a girl's going to answer disagree or disagree completely, one of the two disagreement options in that 5 point scale. And that's going to be tabulated up, right? This is, remember, the measure here is gender dysphoria. And the boy's going to say, uh, disagree or disagree completely to the I hate menstruating item because there's nothing you can do to a boy to make him start menstruating, just like there's nothing you can do to a girl to make her have erections, right? And so the scores get tabulated, and now they have low scores, right? They started at presumably high gender dysphoria because that's why they're in the study. And now, midway, after you've done some things to them, you switch the questionnaires and you're giving them the invalid opposite sex questionnaire. And now the scores just hit the floor, right? So that was the goal of the study, to reduce gender dysphoria. And you show that you reduced it. And people who don't read carefully won't know that you switched the measures. You rigged it. You're asking girls about their erections, so of course they're going to say no. I disagree, and therefore they get a lower gender dysphoria score. Well, that's insane. This is a much deeper problem than scientific, valid scientific methods and research validity, as you were talking about, like what, the methods scientists would use. The problem here is that when it comes to social science and this sort of biomedical research that kind of blends into social science and psychology, there are no standards. So there are no methods scientists would normally use, right? No one has ever done this before. No one has ever done this to kids before. And so this is a completely unfamiliar terrain, but fundamentally, this is something where any layperson could come in and blow the whistle. This is something where this is just an insane cult ideology where you are treating this boy like he's a girl. And since the ideology stipulates that he was a girl before he even started the study because he says he's a girl. You should have been giving him the girl's version to begin with, right? Why didn't they do that? Well, probably because then they would show no results because the gender dysphoria would be at the floor if they gave him the girl's version from the outset because you'd be asking him about menstruating right at the beginning and he would show low gender dysphoria. Therefore, you'd have no justification for proceeding, for acting, for doing anything to them. But they didn't do that because then they wouldn't have a study. But the ideology, if they were consistent with the ideology, they would have treated them in accordance with their so-called gender identities from the outset. So by switching, they created an artificial drop in gender dysphoria by switching the questionnaires. That's just rigging. That's not really uh, there's no methodological standard you can refer to here because this is completely new and novel research, insane research that should never have been conducted to begin with. But that's just rigging. That's where, Joe the plumber could come in and say, and call BS on this, right? This is where just any random barista is, well, maybe not a barista because there's 50% chance they're caught up in this anyway, right? But any random plumber could come in and operate with a higher level of intellect and scholarly rigor than a PhD academic who's a tenured faculty member and knows how to use statistical software, right? So this was just insane. Um, and then Olson Kennedy did something similar. What she did is, as I mentioned at Children's Hospital LA, they cut off the breasts of approximately 46 uh, girls aged 13 to 17. Now, I say approximately because we know about 33. They abandoned 26. There were 26 participants, both minors and young adults, for whom they had no follow-up. They cut off their breasts, but they don't have any data or follow-up. And they abandoned them basically giving, they gave like Tinder date excuses, saying that like they didn't have a phone number for the person or that they called and left a message. Maybe they left two messages. I don't believe them either way. But it was that kind of excuse, and I was just stunned reading that in the paper about like how they lost these 26 people. You know, since about half their known participants were kids, I assume at least half of the loss of the people who didn't show up again and didn't respond were also kids. I think it's possible that more than half were. It's sad to think about it. Maybe disproportionately they were kids. But it was stunning reading that and realizing, wait, they didn't even try to contact these girls, right? And even the 18 and 19-year-olds are basically still kids. And they were caught up in this cult while they were kids, right? If they were getting their breasts cut off at age 18 or 19, right? So um, they didn't go to their homes. They didn't like knock on their doors. I was stunned by that. Like they were, I had a whole like I remember having this whole night, and this is why I didn't want to read any of this. This is why I stayed away for over a year because I was afraid of what I'd find. But I had a whole night when I was just almost writhing and shocked that they treated these kids, these girls, whose healthy breasts they cut off, like they were just ordinary patients. Like they were just people who came in for some Botox or people who came in for knee surgery or, whatever. They treated them the same way they treated everyone else, which is no follow-up, which is we don't care about you now that we have your money, now that the insurance is paid, completely forgetting about them. And that's been happening all over the country. These chop shops take a knife to kids and then they just completely forget about them. And that is just amazing. And I think we need to figure out a way to charge them. I mean, this is where we need the prosecutorial flexibility for which America is known, right? And that was just amazing. So they gave these Tinder date excuses. They didn't follow up 26 girls. Now imagine why would girls not respond? Why would these 26 girls and young women not respond to like a voicemail or whatever solicitation they got for follow-up to find out how they're doing? Well, you can imagine the horror some of them might be in at the fact that they had their breasts cut off, which they can never get back, despite an insane claim that Olsen Kennedy herself made in a video that you can just get them back later. She treated it like as this trivial ornamental thing. Breasts are not ornaments. No, they're not just lumps of flesh. No, 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 no. These are important organs and they serve important functions. These women will never be able to nurse their babies. They will never be able to breastfeed because they don't have breasts anymore. And there are complex hormonal dynamics. It's not just about, uh, breastfeeding and milk production. There are important hormonal dynamics with that happen during pregnancy and during nursing and after, postpartum, but I think possibly even outside of those phases with oxytocin and other hormones. And, they're also important for sexual attraction, and that's not irrelevant. So as a lot of these girls desist later and decide they're not trans, like Chloe Cole and others, um, they might rue and be depressed about the fact that they don't have their breasts anymore. You can read, the sad stories about women who lost their breasts due to breast cancer and what it meant to them, right? This is not a simple, trivial thing. They're not mere ornaments. So anyway, a girl who is horrified at what has been done, what she agreed to have done, obviously would be reluctant to follow up, reluctant to respond to these people, to the people who did this to her, right? So there's an inherent selection bias in only talking to, the girls or the participants who respond favorably to your solicitations. But what Olson Kennedy then did, the follow-up was simply her bespoke chest dysphoria questionnaire. So I mentioned gender dysphoria in the Dutch study. That's, fundamentally, more broad. This is just chest dysphoria, something Olson Kennedy just came up with. And she created the scale and she didn't validate it. So when you create a scale, you're supposed to validate it. These are the standards. So here's an example where normal standards of research weren't satisfied. So she just had a couple of trans people helping her come up with these items. Yeah, she did. I don't even think she knows what it means to validate a scale psychometrically. But she created this scale, and critically, the scale assumes you have breasts, right? It only has meaning if you have breasts. So it was rigged in a similar way as the Dutch study item switching. What she did is she asked these girls questions like if they bind at night. That's one of the items on the chest dysphoria scale. If they bind at night. Well, bind what? And this is in reference to chest binders, which a lot of these girls are encouraged to use. It's unhealthy, it's risky. That really tightly, tightly, tightly binds their breasts, their chest. And they might wear them, at night when they sleep and what have you, and maybe during the day too. And this is this, sort of rejection of their bodies, rejections of their femininity, and so on. Some of which, can be driven by sexual assault, right? And other factors that you want to learn about to find out what's going on. No, but these people never do. But so they asked them if they bind at night. Well, you just cut off their breasts. What are they going to bind? There's nothing to bind, right? So that's invalid. So of course they say no. In fact, every single participant said no to that, obviously, since there's nothing left to bind. So that meant their chest dysphoria scores were at the floor. Now, she's so incompetent, she didn't even do a pre-post. She doesn't have chest dysphoria scores for these girls before surgery. She only has after. Um, but it doesn't matter since it's invalid, it's insane. There's nothing we can do with a scale that assumes they have breasts, right? It was destined to show a drop, even if she had the pre in addition to the post. So she just shows floor level chest dysphoria, where they answered zero to almost every item. And so again, it's rigged. It's like, wait, you know, you asked about breasts they no longer have. This is tautological, right? So that's another example of how research is rigged. And these are issues that just require something beyond the normal scientific training and the steeping in statistics and advanced methods and so on. You just need to be able to read and think. And I think this is an issue where academics uh, really struggle to understand the authority of logic and the fact that, you probably saw this paper I republished the other day called uh, "Data is Overrated," and this is another example of that. In that, if you just read the items, you would know the study's invalid, and you could go make a sandwich, right? You'd be done. You don't need to read anything else. The data, the results don't matter, right? But no one reads the items, even though they're right there in the study, which is unusual. Usually they hide the items. So this is just an issue where we need exogenous intelligence. We need outside intelligence, outside authority to come in and point at this and say, this is invalid. And I think this is where insiders, scientists, academics have a hard time making these calls. They have a hard time with understanding validity, and they're so caught up in the details of their methods and their fields. They just don't understand, the logical invalidity of asking girls whose breasts you've already cut off if they bind at night. And that's typical. So now we've got the Dutch study and we've got the Olson Kennedy mess at the Chop Shop in Children's Hospital, LA. And you can see how this research is just rigged, right? All the advanced statistics and protocols in the world don't matter. The research was just rigged. And we need to be better at understanding that and getting this research retracted and vacated. It just needs to be removed from the literature. It does not represent knowledge. If it's invalid, that means it has no epistemic standing. It means it doesn't have any information for us. It doesn't add any knowledge to our civilization. It's just has no standing and needs to be removed from the literature because it's just pollution.
You mentioned sexual signaling and its importance actually to the creation of our happiness as human beings. There, a couple of years ago, on Exalancic's Substack, I don't know if you follow Exalancic, she posted a TikToker who was about to go through a double mastectomy and had a relationship with a young man that seemed to be a happy relationship. And she was going in for the surgery, and I said, he's going to leave her in the comments. And I said this because, I am familiar with the data on how many women, unfortunately, end up divorced after getting breast removal as part of, cancer surgery. That is a sad reality of cancer survival for women. Is a very high divorce rate. So I said he's going to leave her, and it took 2 days. It literally took 2 days. The surgery, 2 days later, he left. Because men actually do like breasts. So it is important for the future happiness of a female. Absolutely. Which brings me to ask, what would you accept as the minimum requirement for a gender identity, scare quotes, to be an objective phenomenon, right? What scientific bells would it have to ping for you to be real?
So at minimum, I would want evidence that this gender identity, separate from sex, emerged without indoctrination. And that's a critical aspect that is missed in this focus on evidence for the benefits of pediatric gender medicine. And I mentioned before how in the Dutch study, with if a doctor had a child come to them and said, "I'm trans," and then you ask them, "Well, what does that mean?" And they said, um, "My gender identity is different from the sex I was assigned at birth." Well, at that point, you would stop, you'd blow the whistle because there are a couple of terrible things wrong there. But one of the things that doctors should want to know is, where did they get these ideas? Why do they have a gender identity? Who told them to have a gender identity? Who told them they could have a gender identity, right? So for gender identity, like a discordant or, a counter-sexual gender identity, to be real in the sense of it being something that is innate and maybe, there's so many questions that have to be answered there. But if it's something that we say uh, there was some psychological predisposition to in a tiny percentage of the population, which would be a much smaller percentage of the population than is currently saying that they're trans, then it would have to be something that emerged without indoctrination. So what's happening right now is kids are indoctrinated in gender ideology. And in many cases, they're indoctrinated from kindergarten. And, it doesn't necessarily matter what state you're in, red state, blue state, yada, yada. Some states have started to act against this, but, until a couple of years ago, you could have seen this in Florida or Texas. And in some cases, you might still see it in Florida or Texas. But kids are told that they have a gender identity that is separate from sex. And they're told that their sex, was assigned at birth and that sometimes doctors make mistakes. So right away, they're attacking sex, they're attacking the reality and the objective reality of sex by this Orwellian formulation, falsely saying that it's assigned. No, it's not assigned. It's an objective fact. It's observed, and often, more often, it's observed before birth, right? So they get kids to believe that sex is just something a doctor said they were. They also get kids to believe that sex is just about genitals. This whole ideology has a consistent focus on genitals, reducing sex to genitals. But, sex is so much more than genitals. I mean, men and women have comprehensively, structurally different bodies. So, and they get kids to to believe that they either have or likely have a gender identity. And they might also say that everyone has a gender identity. And some people are so-called cisgender, whatever. And they install these wedges and they install these ideas that sex is just something that you were assigned at birth. It doesn't matter. Doctors make mistakes. Also, sex is a spectrum, so they're attacking sex. They're not really differentiating sex and gender like they said they did. And so, and then in some cases, they are requiring kids to discover and report their gender identity, not just pronouns, but their actual gender identity. So in the Portland schools, for example, Portland, Oregon, their K through 5 curricula, kindergarten through fifth grade curricula, tells kids that there are as many genders as there are stars in the sky. As many as there are stars in the sky. And they imply to kids that they can create their own gender. So you're not just limited to being trans or even non-binary. You could just create a random word if you wanted, like plethora or something. That's my gender. The way they also create arbitrary pronouns that are not even pronouns in the English language, like the one with the Z and there's also the letter E and so on. So there, if you if you tell kids you have a gender identity, only you know what it is. So anyone contesting it, they don't have the right. It's invalid. Adults, parents, don't matter. You have a gender identity, only you know what it is. There are as many genders as stars in the sky. Now, next week, we're going to ask you what yours is. Well, what we expect would happen then proceeds to happen, which is now some percentage of kids are saying they have a gender identity that is, not their sex. And that ruins any ability to assess gender identity as an innate objective reality, objective in the sense that it's maybe an innate predisposition, that would be locked in at birth or something to have this, gender identity. But really, identity is too high level, too abstract to even to speak of something that could be locked in at birth because identity itself, that's a high level political abstraction. That's a leftist abstraction. Humans don't need to have uh, conscious formal identities. They don't need to play the intersectional rodeo, right? Humans have happily existed for, thousands of years without even thinking about whether they're men or women, right? Or they might have an identity as a member of a tribe or a member of a nation or a people, and as a member of a family, but they don't formalize it. They don't think my identity, right? They don't need that higher order abstraction. And that's what this is a higher order abstraction and weapon, ultimately. So apparently humans don't need that. Uh, it's clear that children don't need that. They don't need to be told that they have a gender identity. So that makes discovery of something real very difficult because you're indoctrinating kids in this cult ideology, and this was just installed in school districts nationwide practically overnight without discussion, without, any kind of attempt to persuade. And that's how we mostly encounter leftist ideology. We encounter it as indoctrination, where we weren't asked, nothing was explained, there was no conversation, there was no discussion. All these assertions are just made and they're just given to kids the same way you teach them about photosynthesis, right? They're teaching kids in like that Portland program that gender is colonized, right? That's a very high level uh, leftist dogma you'd find in universities. And they tell kids that the indigenous peoples of North America, they didn't have the so-called gender binary. See, they're just creating all these arbitrary constructs, and that they were all like transy and fluid and everything, all the Indians, and that it was white people, white colonizers, who forced the gender binary on these idyllic Indians all over North America who had no need for such crass, constructs, and that they were, the gender is colonized, they forced this binary. And of course, so now they're rewriting history and they're forcing their ideology into the minds of the long dead. They're like the people who settled America from Europe would have no idea what a gender binary was. Like all humans, they were aware that there were two sexes, male and female, and probably didn't give it much thought beyond that, right? It's not something we need to think about. It's just a basic substrate of reality. So they didn't have any of this in their heads, and they weren't forcing it on anyone. They didn't encounter a bunch of trans Indians or anything. So this is all just nonsense that is fed into these little kids. And of course, the next day, these little kids will be given a lesson about American Indians that idealizes them and sanctifies them and treats them as these pure victims, right? This completely one-sided history. And so it's it ties in with that they idealize the American Indians, and then now they're saying they were all like gender fluid and they didn't have this binary. Yeah, that would be news to them, and they so that kind of reinforces each other. So they're they're like reciprocally validating both narratives, right? In that case, so that's key. If we want to discover something about gender identity, it's probably going to be a differently shaped construct than that, but critically, it has to be free of indoctrination. You'd want to see humans who have never been indoctrinated like these American kids are. They say in other cultures, that'd be a good place to look, right? Go to like remote Mexican villages because in the cities they've seen some colonization themselves from, American leftist ideology. But if you go into remote villages and you go into, go further south, go into El Salvador, they have some, trans something people. But if you go into like communities where they're not indoctrinating kids, that's where you would find something more real. And then you could find out what exactly we're talking about. Is it just dysphoria? Is it just gender nonconformity? If feminine men, masculine women, are you talking about something more interesting than tomboys, right? So you would roll up your sleeves and do that work, but that's not what's happening, right? They're not doing that work, and doctors are just participating in this rodeo where we indoctrinate kids to believe they have a gender identity. We even make them discover and surface it to us, and then next scene, they're at the doctor's and they're regurgitating that, and the doctor is saying, "Ah, trans kid, I need to, get a needle and maybe get a scalpel," and on we go. So that's just circular. That's just the kids repeating back what they were indoctrinated in. That's not anything. And of course, another area where we could maybe find something real would be brain studies. That's been misused so far, and brain research is fMRI in particular was had major validity problems up until very recently, maybe still does. But it's very easy to see what you want in fMRI studies, given the nature of the data crunching. And there's a famous study of a dead fish. I think it was a dead salmon that one researcher used as an example to prove that, look, we saw so-called activation in this dead fish. So what we're calling activation when we look at live humans may not be what we think it is, right? So you can look that up. That's pretty funny. But that's what we need is we need rigorous science free of leftist ideology where someone would be looking at people probably not in the West, in non-Western cultures, and see what we have. And they'd have to answer like why this construct of gender in the sense of identity, it doesn't exist in most languages, right? So this is very new. It's generally a white Western leftist, you know, cult, truly, but it doesn't. There's no trace of it even in in the language of most cultures, or in our language until the last few decades.
You just said something really interesting, and it made me think that one of the things that's very unscientific about Genderwoo is that instead of trying to eliminate confounding factors, right, to identify and say, okay, we're not going to include this, we're not going to include that, we're going to, these are not transgender children, right? Instead, every child is transgender. Every child that has any reason at all to identify as transgender is believed to be transgender, right? So instead of identifying and eliminating confounds, confounds are deliberately rolled up into the definition or rolled up diagnostically into this overshadowing definition. What are some principles that I would follow if I wanted to create some fake science, right? What modeling would I take from gender woo science in order to create fake science? Like, what lessons can I learn as a fake scientist?
If you wanted to create fake science, the key is using rigged measures because most of the science we're talking about, it just has to do with questionnaires, right? These are the measures, surveys, self-report, questionnaires, self-report surveys. So that's really easy. Now you have a lot of power over the dark arts, because you can just create your own scales, right? That's what Olson Kennedy did. And the Dutch researchers used an existing scale of gender dysphoria. You can create your own scales, and the key is to give it multiple points. So it's a multi-point scale, right? So you've got typically at least five, maybe 7 points, and it's going to be agreement to disagreement, that kind of scale. And you can rig the questions to get the answers you want. That's so in the case of Olson Kennedy and the Dutch researchers, you can get floor level responses just by rigging the questions or switching the scales, right? But you don't even need to do that. You don't need to get floor level responses like they did. Instead, um, you can do something like what social psychologists commonly do, is create an invalid caricature scale like social dominance orientation or right-wing authoritarianism with these ridiculous items that conservatives don't even understand, and get conservatives to answer, say, at the midpoint, and get leftists to answer at the floor. And even though conservatives don't endorse the items, you can just use linear correlation because conservatives are higher than leftists. Um, Even though they don't endorse the items, you can say that conservatism predicts these horrible sounding things, right? Like social dominance orientation or right-wing authoritarianism. And you can get that even without the conservatives endorsing the items because you just exploit the difference where they land and where leftists land. And conservatives could be at the confused midpoint, like neither agree nor disagree, because they don't know what you're talking about, or they even might slightly disagree, but they're like at a 3 on a 7-point scale, right? And leftists would be at 1 and 2, just stronger disagreement than conservatives, but they both disagree. And you're not disclosing that because you don't put the descriptive statistics in your paper. You just disclose the inferential statistics, the correlation, and you can get a correlation just by that difference. So that's the beauty of a multi-point scale. You can use a multi-point scale to exploit like a small difference where, say, leftists are at the floor, conservatives are at the midpoint or just below. Run the correlation and then give the scale a horrible sounding name like social dominance orientation and say that conservatives, are higher in it without disclosing that they're actually low in it. They're just not as low as leftists. And that you can just use a bunch of p-values and statistically significant correlations to just, tell a story that other academics will buy because they will wave it through. The peer reviewers will wave it through and it will be published. They won't stop you from doing this at all. So it's all about, if you want like fake science, the key is the scales for the kind of science you're talking about, because obviously there'd be no point talking about complicated physics or whatever. But the kind that pretty much anyone can do is just manipulate the scales, create a multi-point, a response scale, make the items invalid, or make them so that you get the little spread that you want, the little bit of variance you want, and then you can tell a misleading story. So the power to create scales is the key power that that trashy social scientists use, and now biomedical researchers too.
Being able to scale something means being able to manipulate the data, basically.
But
That's
yeah,
interesting.
I mean the actual like survey scales. We call them scales, right? So to create a survey, a questionnaire, like call it whatever you want, like chest dysphoria, right? Or social dominance orientation. You write the items, meaning you put the words in your participants' mouths. The participants don't get to talk. They don't get to express their actual views. They're forced to respond to your items. So you get to write the items. You get to set the response scale, which is the points like 1 to 5, 1 to 7, strongly disagree, strongly agree, all that. And with that, you get a lot of power to mislead and to get in the news.
Recently, you caught onto a Daily Beast article that is a decade old that fabricated science to pathologize homophobia. Now, no one is claiming that gay shame doesn't exist, but this was something sinister and political. And it's been sitting out there misinforming the public for 10 years. This is the misuse and abuse of diagnosis against an enemy, real or perceived. Talk about that, if you would, please.
Yeah, that was an amazing example, perhaps the most extreme example of a media outlet literally fabricating scientific findings. So I only use the word literally to mean literally. So what happened here is that Daily Beast, which is this leftist outlet, claimed that uh, so-called homophobia was linked to mental illness. And they proceeded to fabricate, they were reporting a study by some Italian researchers that found two correlations between so-called homophobia, which they did not actually measure. They did not actually find homophobia, but they correlated it with two mental health type variables. The Daily Beast added several more. The Daily Beast added things like hyper-masculinity and uber religiosity as being correlates of so-called homophobia. Those variables do not exist in the study. In fact, no version of religiosity or masculinity exists in the study. The Daily Beast fabricated these variables and their correlation with homophobia. So, and that's right in the start of the article, this Daily Beast article from 2015. And I was just stunned because I I went to the study they were citing. I read it. I saw that these variables didn't exist in the study, and that the Daily Beast was therefore fabricating it. I emailed the Daily Beast and explained the situation. Yeah, the your writer listed all these variables as being linked to homophobia, but most of these don't exist in the study. No response. I waited a week or two, emailed them again. No response. All that was in 2015. So this is one of many examples. I'm sitting on, a ton of examples of false claims and fraud in the media and related claims in science that have just been sitting out there uncorrected, right? I think people don't realize how common it is for the media to make false claims. And I think they assume that, false claims get corrected when you notify them, but sometimes that happens. But there are pervasive false claims in leftist outlets like the Daily Beast or hoax specialists like Rolling Stone with all the hoaxes they pushed. And even in places like the New York Times and CNN, there are lots and lots of false claims we can just go look and find right now. So that's what the Daily Beast did. And they tried to make these so-called homophobic views a sign of mental illness, which is really sick and malicious. And even under their headline, they put this stamp with the word diseased. They just put diseased, that's it, in red, in like surrounded by pipes. So that attempt to pathologize essentially conservatives or to pathologize just normal people for so-called homophobia, that's incredibly malevolent of them to do, especially since they fabricated most of the links. Their claims were false.
You were telling me about journalist. This has been controversial before. I didn't get it when I first heard someone on the political right making a fuss in about 2010 or so. But I understand now. So talk about that if you would.
Oh, so Journalist was this private forum or email list, discussion list that a number of leftist journalists participated in, I think up to 2011 at least, and it was organized by Ezra Klein. And I think what came out of that story were a couple of things. One was that they were coordinating, they were trying to coordinate and unify certain narratives. Like they wanted to have uh, like a coordinated downplaying of Barack Obama's links to that really radical, angry preacher. I don't, was his name Wright or something? I forgot the preacher's name. But so this is an
Jeremiah
instance.
Wright, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So this is an instance of what, like I mentioned, that where too many conspiracy theories are just true, and it makes it hard to treat conspiracy belief as as any kind of pathology or something that's a unified thing. So the idea that the media coordinates behind the scenes to push certain narratives, uh, certain narratives that advance leftist ideology or that are inherently leftist or Democratic Party aligned narratives. Well, that's been a suspicion for a long time. It's obviously true. I don't think they would even need to try very hard, since if you have a media that only pretty much employs leftists, you're going to get that spontaneously. But in this case, they were coordinating, trying to downplay that story, the links to Jeremiah Wright. And what struck me most was in Ezra Klein's comments or responses to like the public revelation of the existence of this journal list. um, was that he said it wasn't supposed to be ideological, but that it was more about being empirical, right? So everyone in the list was a leftist or left of center. I use the term just to mean left of center. Um, so that's an interesting bias he had that uh, I've seen many times where leftists deny that they're ideological and they try to give themselves a different basis or foundation for their views. And one might be that it's empirical. Well, whether an issue should be a political issue at all and whether it should be approached empirically is an ideological or philosophical question, right? You don't escape ideology by saying something is empirical. So a good example of this is a famous study by, I believe, Lord, Ross, and Lepper. It would be around 1979-ish. Famous Stanford social psychologists. They wanted to see if they could change people's minds on the death penalty, right? So what they did is they did this ridiculous study where participants came in, probably college students, and they gave participants fake news articles to read. And participants were randomly assigned to different conditions. And one of the conditions would be to read an article uh, supporting the death penalty as working to reduce the murder rate in states that adopted it, right? So they had an article that said, an article they wrote, a fake article, that showed that death penalty works because it reduces the murder rate in these states compared to states that didn't adopt it or that maybe kill fewer people or whatever. And then they had a similar article, the symmetric opposite, which was the death penalty doesn't work. It doesn't reduce the murder rate in the states that have adopted it, and so on. So these are the different conditions, and they took people who had strong views. They pre-selected people who had strong views on the death penalty, pro and against, and they gave them, the opposite position article, right, to see if they would change their views. So then they read the article, and then I don't know if it was the same day or sometime after, they're asked to they're asked about their views again. They're asked to see, if their views have changed on the death penalty. And their views did not change. And Lord Ross and Lepper wrote something about, they lamented that we cannot expect rationality. Rationality, I'm pretty sure that was the word. We cannot expect rationality from people because of this study where these idiots in a lab coat are handing an article to participants to read in this psychology study, and that after reading a stupid article some guy in a lab coat gave them, they didn't change their minds, right? And there are a few things wrong with that, but one is the premise. The premise is that one's views on the death penalty should be empirically informed, that you should have an empirical basis, that your views should have an empirical basis, that your views should be based on whether it, quote, works in reducing murder rates. Not just works empirically in some way, but specifically that the variable you care about is the murder rate, right? And that's a huge mistake, right? They assumed it's an empirical issue. It's not, right? Views on the death penalty are fundamentally moral, philosophical issues. It's two competing visions of justice. It's different, it's competing moral concerns. Kind of like abortion. This is not an empirically driven issue. It's people who think that as a matter of justice, someone who is properly convicted of murder, someone who has murdered someone and by due process has been convicted of the same, or maybe someone who has sexually molested a child, that's a popular one now, people calling for the death penalty. But if someone has done this thing, they forfeit their right to life, and justice requires that they be executed, right? As that's justice. Whereas other people are coming at it from the philosophical position that uh, we the state does not have the right to kill, that we cannot give people to give the state the right to kill, and also uh, I think heightened concern about the possibility of wrongful conviction of executing someone who is innocent. And these people view the they view the prospect of ever executing someone who is innocent as incredibly important and more important than executing the guilty. So these are issues of justice, right? There, most people do not take a matter of fact empirical approach to the death penalty. It's in capital punishment. It's a philosophical, moral issue. So giving them material to read by a guy in a lab coat, which they're not going to take seriously. But I mean, to expect them to change their views, I mean, I don't think humans would have survived on this planet if our minds were so flaccid and gullible that we would change our views on such fraught issues because some guy in a lab coat in a psychology study at some university where we happen to attend is giving us an article that argues, some empirical thing about the death penalty, right? That's ridiculous. If you change your mind that easily, I just don't think you're going to make it very long. So, that's ridiculous too, but the premise is also ridiculous that it's an empirical issue. And that's what struck me about Klein. Klein is really, really biased on the empirical thing. And he once said that he compared how productive Congress was, how productive one Congress was compared to another Congress, another session, by how many laws they passed. And he treated productive is a good thing, like productive is generally a good thing, but he called it a matter of productivity. Like they passed 170 laws, they only passed 140, so this Congress is more productive. I'm like, yeah, that's moronic. I mean, we definitely don't want to optimize for the number of laws, maximum number of laws passed, right? That's horrifying. So he's someone who doesn't understand like Iglesias, he doesn't understand the good uh, beyond empirical level, and political partisan gamesmanship.
It doesn't matter that, it was the Leopards Eating People's Faces Act. It only matters that it passed, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the number is higher. We see the number go up. We,
You've written that we have to stop paying attention to the journals, the scientific journals, that they're captured. We have to pay attention to the studies instead. Can you help listeners navigate the problem of being a science consumer in a world that is full of fake science?
yeah, I think it's underexposed with uh, this heightened focus in recent years, especially with COVID, on this leftist authoritarian epistemology of believing experts, trusting experts, believing the science, right? That something is lost in that you don't actually need experts or the science to intercede or to be intermediaries between you and reality. So I'm working on a principle I call the reality direct principle. And the idea is that you want to bring yourself as close to reality as possible on all these issues. You want to get as close to reality as possible. And this authoritarian epistemology and the heuristics of believing so-called experts is not going to work in general. It's not going to get you close to reality. If you hew to that kind of heuristic, you'll probably be worse off in terms of your congruence with reality, the truth and accuracy of your beliefs. So a few issues come to mind where a literate person, if you're a literate person who you don't even need a college degree, I think, in some of these cases. If you can read well, you can actually survey the science behind hot button issues. The reason is that there's not much of it. So in a few cases, there's actually very little science in terms of like the number of studies, the number of papers behind hot button issues. Gender ideology and pediatric gender medicine is one of those issues where, as I went into on my report for the West Yang Substack Year Zero, there might be 4 or 5 studies at this point. And by studies, I'm referring to, I mean, a few criteria to filter out the noise. One is it has to be an actual study, which means there are participants. This is data collection. Something is done with participants. That's a primary study, right? Most of what's out there on pediatric gender medicine is not that. It's statements, policy statements, standards of care, standards of practice, recommendations, guidelines. It's all just mostly propaganda coming from, different leftist medical lobbies and so on. So, like I said, with the pediatrics group, the AAP, they didn't cite any science and didn't make any scientific arguments in their policy statement, right? It's all other sorts of material. So, one criteria has to be an actual study. You want to go after the actual studies. Skip all the intermediate stuff. The other issue is that in getting to just 4 or 5 studies is that it has to be about kids. So you might hear people citing some studies citing a low regret rate for trans-identified people who had maybe some sort of surgery or had hormones or something like that. Well, most of that is not about kids, and I mostly just care about the kids. Those studies of adults generally are invalid too because they lose a lot of people to follow up, um, or they only count people who still consider themselves trans and so on. But if you're just limiting it to kids, you're going to find very few studies exist. And then the other criteria is that they're actually doing something like the puberty blockers, the hormones, or they're taking a scalpel to kids and doing some kind of surgery, and they're assessing some sort of well-being outcome, like it's typically depression, anxiety, suicide, dysphoria, that kind of thing. Typically self-report scales. So they're doing those things and they're measuring some kind of well-being outcome. So I wouldn't count studies that just measure whether puberty blockers actually block puberty or delay puberty or whether or some physiological, technical thing about what the hormones are doing, say to hair growth or something like that. But I don't care about that. I care about the well-being studies. So if we're talking about primary studies of kids that do that look at psychological well-being, there are only 4 or 5 studies out there. So that's something you can read in an afternoon. You as a mom, you as a plumber, you as anybody who can read well, you can read in an afternoon. And you could just find out for yourself what they're doing, and you could discover potentially that the research is invalid if, for example, you noticed Olson Kennedy's chest dysphoria questionnaire, assuming girls still had breasts, and it sunk in that, wait a minute, this is what they gave them after they cut off their breasts. They're giving them a questionnaire that assumes they still have breasts. Well, wait. How is this possible? How could they get this published? That will be an unpleasant discovery. But yeah, a person who can read well and who can think and who doesn't go in with any kind of bias about a journal article having to be true or having to be valid can make a lot of headway just doing that. Another issue would be like mask efficacy with respect to COVID, like real world mask efficacy in preventing, or reducing COVID infection rates or whatever, the outcome variable would be. There's very little research on that too. There was very little research by the end of 2020, and that hasn't changed. There was one randomized trial that was Danmark in Denmark. And today there is one randomized trial, Danmark in Denmark. So that's something you can just read, and you could also read, the Cochrane review, the systematic review that mostly covered research on other respiratory viruses because there's hardly any research on COVID and masks. So don't underestimate my message is don't underestimate your ability to engage directly with the scientific evidence, directly with the scientific studies in journals. You won't understand everything, some of the statistics maybe, but in these sorts of topics like mask efficacy or cutting girls' breasts off, like You're not reading about the Higgs boson. You're not reading about a particle collider. It's actually mostly understandable to outsiders, to lay people. You can just go read the primary material, and in many cases, there's not a lot of it. And that itself will be an important discovery, that you will discover that the science behind some issue like mask efficacy with respect to COVID or, pediatric gender medicine, you'll find that the science is very limited. It's very small. It's not very extensive. There's only a few published studies, right? So that discovery in itself is worth something. It's worth something to realize, wait a minute, there's really not much going on. The other thing you should do, I think, and you can do as just a regular person who wants to be a good science consumer and just sort of navigating reality, is when you're presented with a question or a topic, think about what sort of evidence we would need to answer the question. And even though you're not a scientist, although some of you listeners are, you can think productively about what sort of evidence would we need to answer the question. You don't want to make the mistake of just going on Google or DuckDuckGo and um, searching for, the topic and just taking for granted that whatever is sitting out there is valid, that whatever is sitting out there is the kind of research we would need. So, for example, for the trans child thing, where the question of pediatric gender medicine and how whether it works, that's a trap, right? That's a trap. That's a mistake to jump just to the evidence of benefits of so-called gender affirming care, of giving kids blockers and hormones and a scalpel, right? We shouldn't be jumping to benefits of like treatment of a condition when we don't have any evidence of the condition, right? So I think some people outside of academia would have been a lot quicker to realize that, wait a minute, what's the evidence for trans child as some sort of innate condition, right? And also, how do they know a child is so-called true trans or actually trans and isn't going to desist? Most of them desist later. That means they no longer say that they're trans. It's different from detransitioning. Similar word, desistance, detransitioning. Detransitioning is people who have been medicalized, who have got the blockers, the hormones, the surgeries, or all of the above, and are trying to reverse the damage. It's mostly about that. Desisting is just going from identifying as trans to no longer identifying as trans, irrespective of any medicalization. So most desist later. So you'd wonder if you were a parent or any other interested party, why, like how they know that this child isn't going to desist if you just leave them alone or you just get them out of the school. A lot of parents pull their kids out of these horrible schools and report, amazing results. That's hard to do, but I'd almost rather live on the streets than send a kid to these schools. So you'll discover that there's no research, nothing, zero studies pertaining to identifying actual trans children, which is an invalid construct. I mean, there isn't going to be an actual probably, but that purports to differentiate between actual and not actual trans. Like something else is feeding into this: autism, sexual assault, uh, other mental health comorbidities. There's nothing about that. There isn't an empirical study out there that distinguishes between the two and presents any kind of like assessment tool, right? There is no actual assessment tool that's been validated or anything like that. They've got nothing. So when you discover there's nothing, if you ask your doctor for such research, or you search yourself on Google Scholar, you know, and you find nothing, you're going to wonder, wait a minute, how can they do this if they don't even have research on who's really trans and who's not, right? That research would violate the ideology, which is why it doesn't exist, because they're all true trans per the ideology. So you could walk away at that point, right? You could discover that you could, just through thinking about it and looking, that there's no evidence for the condition itself. So talking about benefits of the treatments, it's putting the cart before the horse. And in this context, it's an egregious thing to do. So I guess that just goes in as a lesson in trust yourself to think a little bit, trust yourself to ask questions, especially if you if it's high stakes for you, like you've got a child who's been caught up in this. Um, yeah, you definitely need to trust yourself to ask questions and to read the literature directly. Um, Other research where you could also read the research and understand it would be climate consensus research, because that's generally, if it's valid, it's just surveys. If it's invalid, it's something crazy like having leftist activists work from home and read just the abstracts of journal articles and then decide on their own whether the abstract agrees with their premise of human-caused warming, and then coding that as support for the consensus, right? So that's, you could read that as just a regular person, if and you could maybe, it would sink in, wait a minute, they did what? They read the abstracts to journal, wait, people working from home. Why would you just read the abstract? And what is this? So you, if you knew anything about science, you would know that's not a method known to science. They there is another area where you could trust yourself. It's just unfortunate that there are so many instances of the ivory tower, these supposedly the supposedly advanced scientific civilization where academia is doing completely insanely invalid research. It's getting through peer review. It's in journal articles. It's changing the world. It's driving policy, like the 97% consensus study, which is the one I was just referring to, which counted a welding journal article. They read the abstract of a welding journal article written by Volvo engineers talking about challenges in welding, the new high-strength steels for car making. They read that and counted it as endorsing that's in the 97%. That they coded as endorsing the human-caused warming. Well, yeah, sure, it endorsed human-caused warming because it mentions it in the opening sentence of the abstract, like so many uh, random journal articles in so many random arbitrary fields like welding. And that just means they're contextualizing their work and possibly helping themselves get funded and helping themselves get published by linking it to climate change. But it's about welding, right? These are Volvo engineers, right? These aren't climate scientists. They're not saying anything about climate change other than just a background mention of it. But that got counted as 97% consensus. And if you were a diligent, regular person, that data, they posted the data, the list of all the studies that they rated, along with the actual ratings from these clowns working from home, including the founder of Timbuktu Luggage. No, I kid you not. They, you could read that, you could find that Volvo article, stumble on it, and be like, "Wait, what?" And you'd find another steel making article that was counted. You'd find an article about diarrhea, right? So you could do this without any scientific training. You could discover this is embarrassing. This is frustrating, like from the perspective of, science and scientists. But there's a lot of junk that you can discover just by reading, and you can conclude justly on your own that this is invalid, this is insane. I'm going to go have lunch, right? Like, and not, and you not believe the 97% consensus or whatever it is, or the claim that we have strong evidence that mass-produced COVID spread, or that we have, evidence that, there are trans kids and that, if we don't drug them up, sterilize them, and start, cutting away at them, that they'll kill themselves, right? You'd be justified in rejecting all that stuff just from either common sense or reading the primary scientific literature, which you will mostly understand.
Where can listeners find your work?
You can find most of it on Substack, which is validscience.substack.com. And I'm going to expand that a lot soon. And on X, I'm Valid Science on X also, and that's where I've posted in my pinned post our 2015 journal article with John Haidt and Lee Jussim and others, Phil Tetlock, talking about ideological political bias in research psychology and academic psychology, and how it's undermined the validity of research in the field and so on, and just the lack of representation of any non-leftists in the field, right? Conservatives, libertarians, just non-leftists, right? So that's pinned at my X/Twitter account, and I'll make that available on Substack too, the paper, the PDF and everything. But generally, I'm going to move everything to the Valid Science Substack.
Dr. Jose Duarte, thank you for joining me today. It's been great.
Thanks, Matt. I had a great time talking. These were good questions.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. The Distance is an encampment for everyone made politically homeless by gender ideology. Visit our website at www.thedistancemag.com to support our work with a monthly or annual premium subscription.